Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are calling in from. I am Shadi Salehi. I'm the director of the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, and really pleased to be with you all today on this Tuesday. Before we get started, I know I could use a little bit of a breathing exercise just to arrive and be grounded. So I hope you'll join me. Please mute yourselves. You can go off screen if that feels right, or you can stay on screen if that feels comfortable, and just close your eyes. And we'll take a slow and steady breath in. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Exhale. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Slow inhale. Feel it filling up your rib cage. Hold it at the top. And then exhale it all out. Thank you. Thanks for being with us. So we have over 400 people registered today. Thank you for joining us, and we'll be having people arrive as we come in. Amanda will be letting people in from the waiting room, but we will go ahead and get started. We've got a pretty packed agenda for the day. But first, just an introduction to our summer series. This is a 3-part series dedicated to exploring the purpose, the values, and the practices of trust-based philanthropy. We have a fabulous set of regional partners that have joined in. You can see them all here to help spread the word and engage in some regional specific discussions at the end of the program today. So thank you to all of our partners who have made this possible and have promoted this. We have a 3-part series. So today we're going to be exploring the purpose, culture, and values of trust-based philanthropy. We will not be digging into the actual operationalizing of the principles. Today we're going to be setting the stage to introduce some of the fundamentals of what it means to embrace a trust-based approach. And these are kind of the values and the cultural elements that kind of undergird the whole approach. So we'll be hearing a little bit more about that today, and then we'll have some time to explore and break out. Part 2 and 3 will be an opportunity to dive deeper into the grant-making principles. So we hope you'll join us for the remainder of the program. The way we've set this up is that you'll have to register for each session independently, but you'll have a chance to dig in deeper. And also every session will be recorded, so you'll have a chance to join even if you aren't able to join the actual day of those programs. And we'll be sharing out the recordings after these programs end. So lots of great stuff to explore. We'll be hearing multiple perspectives throughout the series. We'll hear from corporate perspectives, community foundations, private foundations. We're going to do our best to feature a range of perspectives so you can kind of think about how this applies to your own work. So for today's agenda, we will be kind of going through a few things. After we do a brief introduction to what trust-based philanthropy is, we'll hear 2 stories about what it looks like to actually put trust-based values into practice. We'll spend a little time discussing this current moment. As many of you might know or have noticed, trust-based philanthropy is having a bit of a moment. It's kind of trending, and a lot of that has been in response to COVID and the racial reckoning. So we'll hear a little bit from our speakers about why they believe this is a trending moment and why it should be here for the long haul. And then we'll explore what does it look like, what is the ongoing work of building trust internally and externally? What does that process look like? What do roles look like in that context? And then finally, we'll do a quick fire kind of set of insights from our speakers, really making the case for trust-based philanthropy. Maybe you're kind of still on the fence about it. Maybe you have board members or staff that are curious or on the fence about it. So we'll address a little bit of why this is something that we should embrace as a sector. And then at the top of the hour, we will transition to breakouts that will be led by our philanthropic serving organization partners. So if you're affiliated with a PSO, you will be automatically assigned to a room. And if you're not, you can stay in the main room and we'll stay for a discussion as a larger group. And then we should wrap by 11:30. So hopefully you can stay for the whole program. Of course, when you're in the breakouts, it'd be great for you to be on video. But again, whatever you feel most comfortable with. So today we have a fabulous slate of speakers that I'm really pleased to introduce. We've got Dimple Abichandani, who is the Executive Director of the General Service Foundation, based in Berkeley, California, a family foundation, bringing much of that perspective as a longtime practitioner of trust-based philanthropy. We've got John Brothers, the president of the T. Rowe Price Foundation in Baltimore, also a longtime practitioner of trust-based philanthropy, bringing a corporate perspective to today's discussion. And of course, we've got Pia Infante, co-executive director of the Whitman Institute and steering committee chair of the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, one of the early architects of trust-based philanthropy, here to offer some perspective. So we're very delighted to have all of our speakers here today. So I'm going to hand it off to you, Pia, and would love to just hear from you as one of the early founders or early architects of the trust-based philanthropy movement. How do you describe trust-based philanthropy?
Hi, Shadi. Hi, everyone. Really excited to be here today. I love that there's so much collaboration that brought us here. And I think that's part of what brings you trust-based philanthropy. You know, Dimple was involved in a lot of early conversations about what is this and how should we basically re-articulate what we think are not rocket science sort of concepts, but maybe package them for the time and the era that we're in. So when I think about trust-based philanthropy right now, the concept, the value that comes to me is, who are we accountable to? And trust-based philanthropy argues that our accountability really is with the communities, the specific, whether they're geographic and regional, whether they're issue-based or identity-based, communities that we are meant to serve. That is what we're accountable to and who we're accountable to, not necessarily to the bank accounts or to the endowment. And when people ask me, so what is trust-based philanthropy and what isn't it? You know, I think there are a lot of ways to think about what it means to be accountable to the communities that we serve. Some other ways I've heard it described are an equity-based philanthropy, a grantee-centric philanthropy. So I think essentially trust-based is the notion that our job is to really partner with, listen to, and trust the communities, social movements that we serve. And actually, that's where the phrase trust-based philanthropy comes from. It wasn't baked up in some kind of consultant's lab. It wasn't from an academic source. You know, the Whitman Institute, which is the private foundation that I help run and had decided to spend out its endowment, basically turned to all of our grantee partners and used a tool called a grantee perception report to ask, to get some feedback. You know, what should we do with ourselves? You know, how should we think about supporting you? Because we know that now our horizon is set. We're going to be gone in 10 years. And what our community partners, who we feel deeply accountable to, gave back to us was, look, the way that you operate is just, as a package, just different from how we experience other funders. You act as listeners and partners and collaborators, and you know, you're trying to learn with us as we go, as opposed to maybe behaving as comptrollers or exactors of perfection, you know, or judges about the work. It just feels like you're in it with us. I think that's what they would often say. It just feels like you're in it with us. You care about the work as much as we do. You care about the community as much as we do. You want to know what works. And there are not a lot of ways that we have to perform for you. You know, that's what they told us as a funder. We don't feel like we have to perform for you. We can come to you and say, we're having we're going to have a hard time meeting payroll. We're having a difficult leadership transition. I think that's one of the markers to me of whether or not a relationship actually has any trust in it, is that folks are honest and vulnerable, both on the folks receiving the funds and also the funders themselves. So we were vulnerable to our partners. We said, we are not sure what to do with our last 10 years. We think we have some ideas, but we'd really love to get your insights and leadership. So I think that, you know, that's a set of approaches, it's a set of values, but the concept of accountability feels like a big one in this era that we live in. So that's where even the phrase comes from. And then I also think about a philanthropy that is very self-conscious of the limitations of philanthropy. So Shadi, if you could show that slide from the Open Road Alliance. A few years back, the Open Road Alliance did a study of, I think it was around 300 nonprofits globally. And they asked, you know, what are obstacles to you actually achieving the things that you want to achieve? And a very disheartening percentage, almost half, 46% of the obstacles that nonprofits felt like they faced and had a hard time surmounting actually came from funders, right? So not COVID type pandemics, not sort of these unpredictabilities of politics and policy, but literally funders deciding they're going to change course all of a sudden, delays in disbursement of funds, inflexibility about rubrics and paperwork, and just sort of different elements that sort of should show us and demonstrate to us that for all of our good intentions as funders and supporters of social change work, we can often, half the time, get in the way. So I think of a trust-based philanthropy as one that is very conscious and self-conscious of the ways that we can perpetuate power imbalances, racial inequities, hoarding and control versus collaboration and sharing. So, you know, the slide right before it, you know, I'll just end on this. I think in our sector, we can suffer from not actually embodying the values or the vision that, or the missions that we have written on our websites and on our walls and in our minds. You know, we have these intentions. We want to, you know, work against climate change. We want to support democracy. We want to make sure that everyone, you know, big to small, has what they need to thrive. And so we state these values, but in the actual doing of philanthropy, we can so easily replicate the, you know, racial inequities, power imbalances, and basically the not be willing to give up or collaborate or listen or take feedback. So I think trust-based philanthropy is an invitation to demonstrate our accountability to the people we are serving by actually embodying the values that we say that we have. You know, let's just be how we say that we want to be. And we'll hear a lot of great stories from my partners up here, Dimple and John, about that. But I'm sorry that this is a long-winded way to say this is what I think trust-based philanthropy is. And I'm grateful to dig into it even more.
Thank you so much, Pia. I wanted to share another graphic. So we like to think of trust-based philanthropy as part of an ecosystem, right? We look at the role of relationships as part of this greater ecosystem. And part of what we want to embody is if leaders and leadership can embrace some of these values that we're talking about, that can be very influential in how it shows up in other organizations, how it influences the way organizations interact with each other, and how that can ripple out into this greater society that we're all ultimately working for. So at the core of what we're talking about centering relationships, honoring that, doing the ongoing work that requires. And we're also talking about taking a values-based approach where we're acknowledging these power dynamics, that where we're trusting the expertise of grantees and communities, where we embrace a learning mindset over kind of an impact metrics mindset, ultimately working toward this commitment of systemic equity. So as Pia mentioned, so much of what we are in philanthropy for, we want to look at our practices and behaviors to make sure that that gap is not as wide as that it has become, oftentimes unintentionally. How can we be more intentional about living the values that we advocate for in our work every day? So there's 6 principles of trust-based philanthropy where we can put these ideas into practice. Oopsie. And we will dig into these principles in the following 2 sessions. And thank you to Robert Lowe, who noticed that the date was wrong on the 2nd session. So we'll make sure you get the correct date on that. It is all correct on the website and on the registration links. So we won't be diving deep into these, but you'll probably hear examples of these practices coming up in the stories today. But these are some very practical ways in a grant making context that you can embody trust-based values in your grant making work. And we will unpack those in the following 2 sessions. A few things of note to remember. A lot of these trust-based philanthropy practices are not necessarily new. Some of you probably already practice them. You've seen them and heard about them in other people's work. Nonprofits have been advocating for these practices for decades. So what we're talking about is not new. But what we advocate for is the holistic practice with the values at the core. The other thing to remember is that this is a journey, not a checklist. And what that means is this is an ongoing process. It takes time. It takes cultivation. It's not like a one and done kind of approach. And at the end of the day, really the main common denominators that we're talking about here are values. And we'll be hearing about that today from our speakers. So I'm going to invite you all to engage in a little interactive exercise, since we're on Zoom and not in person, and trying to find ways to engage kind of more intentionally. You should be able to see a set of icons at the bottom of your Zoom screen. When you hear examples in today's stories of self-awareness and power awareness, click the heart emoji. And for now, maybe just as an exercise, click the heart if you can find it. Would love to see those hearts. Thank you. If you hear examples of trusting grantees and communities, click the applause button. And maybe even take a note of this so that while we're talking today, you can listen for these examples and click those emojis. I will be doing the same as a reminder. And then when you see examples of learning mindset, examples of taking these learnings and applying them in today's stories, click the celebration button, because we want to celebrate this learning mindset. So I hope you'll engage with us. I'll be kind of clicking those icons as we go, just as a reminder when we see those themes, and maybe make a personal note for yourself so that you can be ready to celebrate those moments when they come up in our stories. All right, that is it for the breakout, or for the screen portion. Okay, so that's enough talking at the top of all this. I would love to move to our speakers and hear directly from Dimple and John and Pia about what it looks like to put these values into practice. So Dimple, I'm going to start with you. Dimple is Executive Director of the General Service Foundation, a family foundation based in Berkeley, California. And Dimple, when you stepped in to lead General Service Foundation nearly 6 years ago, you noticed an unintentional misalignment in the foundation's values and practices. And since then, you've been working intentionally with your team to create better alignment with the way the organization shows up that is more consistent with its values. So Dimple, can you share a little bit more about that journey and what you all have been up to at General Service Foundation?
Yes. Well, so first, thank you, Shadi. Thank you to the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. It's great to see so many people here for this conversation. So I started at General Service Foundation in 2015. And part of what attracted me to the foundation was that I had long known its commitment to social justice. I had witnessed on the staff how this was an institution where partnership was the norm, where there was a deep humility. And as I went through the interview process, I really saw that embodied in the board and how the board showed up, right? So humility, partnership, almost a sense of service and wanting to do our part was kind of the set of values, right? So when I moved into this role, one of the things that I found somewhat surprising was, for a small foundation, our actual practices were quite bureaucratic. And the way that I initially sort of understood that gap was that while our values may not have been the norm in philanthropy, our practices were all really drawn from the kind of what are thought of as like best practices in philanthropy, right? So they came out of a whole framework around compliance, due diligence, and the idea that there's sort of a whole set of legal considerations. Like these were the things that drove our actual day-to-day processes. So, I kind of was observing these things. And then not so long after I got to the foundation, the 2016 election happened. And we fund grassroots organizations working in communities of color on issues like immigrant rights, on racial justice and gender justice. And so it was clear that our grantees were basically going to be on the front lines of what we expected to be a series of really difficult battles. And, as soon as the election happened, all of our conversations internally were about how can we do more? How can we show up? How can we stand with our grantees? So we immediately increased our payout. And a week after the election, my grants manager handed me a stack of grants, contracts, and letters to sign. And I'll say like that, as I was sitting down with my pen, like that was the moment where the divide between our values and our practices hit me, and it hit me in a really emotional way because, I read this grant letter and it did two things. It did not convey in any way the feeling that we were having institutionally of how we wanted to stand with our grantees, how we wanted to support our grantees. And what it did do was that it actually laid out a set of what were in that moment, I could clearly see were a set of burdens on our grantees, right? So we had written reports. For some grants, we had interim reports that had to be completed, and then we had final reports. We had a very long and intimidating contract that followed the letter that spelled out the consequences of not doing something you were supposed to do on time. And so I just was really struck by how our values of partnership, that they just weren't translated. And so I just sat down and made a series of changes. I like edited the contract down to a page, ran it by our lawyer. That's possible to get the contract down to a page. I had already been in conversations with our program officers about how we use all the reports. And we had clarified actually that the purpose of the reports for us was to learn. And so we made a shift to have the reports be phone calls with a program officer, so that if the purpose was our own learning, like we should be the ones doing the work as opposed to the grantees doing the work. And so, I mean, literally it felt like we were freeing up 10 to 14 hours of precious, precious time for every grantee by just making that shift. Shortly after we sent that batch of letters out, I got a postcard in the mail from one of our grantees. And this was a small immigrant rights group in Colorado. And the executive director wrote on the postcard, thank you for eliminating the written reports. It was a lot of stress every time. And I hung that up on my desk for when I used to go to the office for a very long time, because it was such a reminder about how there can be that gap between what we intend. I don't think anyone on our team intended to cause stress to a grantee. So there can be that gap between intention and outcome. And it just, I think for our entire team, seeing the response actually motivated us to then proactively look at every process in our foundation and start with questions like, how do we want this to feel for our grantees, right? How do we want it to feel to apply for funding? How do we want it to feel to get funding? How do we embed in our processes the partnership that is at the heart of the work, and that we know the work won't be successful without that partnership? So that was the start. And then, I would say, like, fast forwarding to where we are 6 years later, we've changed all our defaults. Like our default, I think, used to be project support. Now, 92% of our grants are general operating supports, and that's the default. Like you start there. We sort of default to multi-year grants. I think in this last round, half of our grants were 3-year grants. We completely reimagined our program approach. And as opposed to us saying, here are the issues we think are important, our framework now is about power building, and communities that are trying to build power should and can decide what the issues are that are important to them. And so I would just say, like, in conclusion, like, what allowed us to walk through that series of changes was a shared set of values, and was kind of a shared sense of commitments, and also the process of seeing how every change we made, we got such a positive response, and it made our grant making better, right? Like, we felt like we were doing a better job. And so all of it kind of built on itself.
Thank you so much, Dimple. There's so much packed into that that is just so valuable. And I'd love to turn to John Brothers, who similarly, when you came in, John, at the T. Rowe Price Foundation, you similarly kind of did an examination of the grant making with a real intentionality to embrace T. Rowe Price Foundation's client-centered approach with its financial clients, and bringing that into informing a grantee-centric approach in your grant making. We actually just got a very timely question about how can we get the corporate world to embrace this. So John, could you share a little bit more about your story of when you joined T. Rowe Price Foundation and how you've been embracing these values in your work?
Of course, and thanks so much, everybody, for having me. So I, before coming to T. Rowe about 6.5 years ago, lived in New York City, and I started my career as a community organizer and working in neighborhoods in a number of different places. But I moved from New York, where I was what they called a pracademic, where I studied the nonprofit sector and worked around capacity building and spoke on it, and worked with a lot of philanthropy to now lead a philanthropy here in Baltimore. And so my family and I were really excited. We fell in love with Baltimore instantly, and moved to the city. And my first day at T. Rowe was also the day in which for much of the world was watching Baltimore on CNN and other places during the unrest after the murder of Freddie Gray. And so for me, I came into Baltimore in that environment. And what we had from a lot of folks, and the reason I brought up being a community organizer is that instantly much of my community organizing time really came to the forefront in my working community. And so we had a number of folks at T. Rowe saying, well, what should we do? Like, how should we get involved? And my immediate response is that there isn't anybody in Central West Baltimore waiting for T. Rowe to do anything. Our job is to listen first and foremost. And if you don't know anybody in those neighborhoods by name, how dare us think that we should be doing any work other than just listening? It's awesome to care. We should care. This is our city. But our job in caring and in partnering around the self-determination of communities in Baltimore was to listen and be willing to be led at all times by the self-determination of folks in community. And so that's what we did as a starting point for us to do that work. And so, I didn't know anybody in Baltimore. And so I had the luxury of going to community centers and going to the basements of churches and kind of listening and learning from community folk. And the reason why that's important is if I was known as the head of a foundation, the immediate challenge of having an honest conversation would be very apparent. And that's too bad, right? That's unfortunate. But for that time, no one knew who I was. And so I could sit and just be in community and listen to what community members were saying. And on the outside, folks were saying, well, God, the number one issue in that community has to be workforce or violence or all of these areas. When in fact, after listening, the number one issue that came up time and time again from citizens in that community was that they couldn't get access to fresh fruits and vegetables. In fact, if you want an apple or a vegetable in that community at the time, you'd have to take 2 buses to get it. And that was an important, not that those other areas weren't important, but that was important. And so, but then also there was a lot of folks coming in and from outside of Baltimore saying, we want to be helpful. And I know growing up in my community, I grew up in South Minneapolis, you can help people and do a lot of damage. Helping can christen your dumpster, quite honestly, if you're not listening and doing the work right. And so what we saw is a lot of folks saying, hey, we want to be helpful. And, one initiative was going to try to have entrepreneurs help figure out, how do we help Baltimore? And I was sitting in the living room of a resident who said, I have ideas on how to work on my community. I feel like impact has been done to us by you all, right? I think about that. Impact has been done to us. That word, jargony word that we use in philanthropy all the time, does damage in many, many ways. And this is what this amazing woman was saying. And so for us, we started to think through what is the way in which we show up in this community, and we developed what we call a theory of philanthropy that guided how we do this, that we do it in collaboration, that we're working with partners, a variety of other areas, but all geared towards the idea of building authentic relationships in community and building trust in community. And ultimately that out of that work became, it wasn't known as trust-based philanthropy at the time, but that just became the framework by which we do all of our work. And so similar to Dimple, we don't, our board, when we said, why do we give money in this way? Like, why am I measuring a $15,000 grant? Like what industry does that make sense in, right? And when we had board members who were like, well, isn't that what we do? And I was like, I just so happen to work in a financial services firm. I was like, when you make investments, are you making investments in measuring widgets, or are you making investments in the holistic approach of these companies? And they're like, the latter. And I was like, well, then why would you ask us to do something completely opposite from you? I regard Tiro as really great at investing. Well, the values in which you work on behalf of your client should be the same exact values by which we do that work. And so you don't give, overhead rates, evaluation, all of these things. Like, you're doing evaluation to be a learning organization. You're not doing evaluation to count beans and to hold people into these weird frames. You want to create a community of learners. And so just all of these different things just came to the forefront in terms of how we do our work. And so it actually, from a corporate environment, it created a lot of easy argument to be able to say, and you could see board members know the argument before they started. He's going to ask us, do we do that on the private side? And of course, every single time we wanted to adopt a practice that created better relationship to community, I just had to look to the corporate side in terms of how they work with their clients, and use that to help us make those arguments. And the arguments weren't hard. It wasn't like it was a battle. It was fairly easy to be able to get to the place now where our application is, we don't view it as an application. How our program folks do work in community, right? How we work around evaluation, how we think about all of these different areas are all rooted in that theory of philanthropy, which is centered on trust-based philanthropy. So I'll stop there.
Wow, thank you so much, John, Dimple, and Pia. There are a few themes that are coming up in all three of the remarks that everyone shared. And one is this kind of unintentionality where things have been just going on in our sector because it's just the way that it's been always done. What we're inviting is a moment of pause and reflection. Is what we're doing working? And is it actually reflecting the values that we are out there doing this work to do? And how can we be better and more intentional and more power aware about how we're showing up in this work, and whether the way we're showing up is actually in line with what we say we're about. And we heard some great examples of real intentional alignment of practices as funders to better align and better embody what we stand for and what we're here to do. And what's really interesting, as many of you have probably noticed, in light of our recent kind of intersecting crises that we've all been experiencing, Trust-based philanthropy is having a moment. There is more attention and awareness of the importance of these practices. There's a realization that we can't control or predict what's going to be happening in 18 to 24 months. And we need to trust the leadership and the vision of grantee partners and communities who are experiencing a lot of these issues firsthand. So it's a trending moment for trust-based philanthropy, but I would love to hear from our speakers, and we are running a little behind. So maybe if we could keep it to about 2-minute responses to this question. I know that's kind of hard to do, but starting with you, Pia, you know, in the context of this current moment, a convergence of multiple crises, a global pandemic, economic inequity, climate crisis, racial reckoning, all these things are kind of rolling up into one. Why is it so urgent that our sector adopt a trust-based approach?
You know, the notion that trust-based philanthropy is trending makes me a little anxious, honestly. The idea of something trending sort of feels like hashtag activism, or I got a decolonizer t-shirt, so I'm done. What you've just heard from Dimple and John, and hopefully you heard this as I did, is that the practice of it, the embodiment of it, is a continuous, iterative, emergent thing in deep accountability and partnership. So to me, the notion of trending feels a little bit like a hashtag or a t-shirt. What I think that we're after is to be able to willingly, knowingly, consciously, against our biases, against our preferences, against the norms, operate the way that Dimple and John have described, you know, in such detail, their willingness to be humbled around, you know, I think that there's this notion that funders are supposed to be experts, right? And I think John and Dimple both redefined expertise as the ability to listen to who we're accountable to and adjust or refine and redefine. So, I mean, I think the urgency of trust-based philanthropy is similar to why we need to remake democracy or remake our economic systems or remake how people have access to food. I mean, the depth of inequity is worse now than it was right after the Industrial Revolution when foundations were born. So if philanthropy was supposed to be the answer to inequality, it has clearly proven itself not to be. And because it's proven itself not to be the answer, you know, to deepened, worsened, heightened, you know, huge discrepancies of equity and fairness and access and resources, everything from food to housing to education to, you know, freedom from the tyranny of violence that, you know, comes from the police state, all of that philanthropy has done very little to ameliorate. And so we then are in a moment where not just in philanthropy, but in our society, in our communities, at our dinner tables, in the schools our kids go to, in our churches, in our synagogues, where everywhere we are is the moment to reimagine, like go non-traditional, go anti, you know, white supremacist structures that were baked into every structure that we live in, literally every single one. So it's not just a time for philanthropy, it is the time, you know, it's the crises, the multiple crises of our era. I think there's just no hiding place from that. So whether we work in philanthropy, whether we work anywhere or everywhere else, there's just no hiding from. We either get on the right side of history and turn the ship around because it really is the Titanic, you know, or we don't. That I think that to me is a response to your question.
Thank you, Pia. Would love to hear from you, Dimple. Why is it so urgent that philanthropy adopt a trust-based approach right now?
So +1 to everything that Pia just said, and it is the time. And, you know, I would say there are two reasons that come to mind for me about kind of why trust-based approaches in this time. So the first is, you know, as we urgently try to turn the ship around, we want to do it in a way that's going to be effective, right? And the reason that we keep getting in our own way is that in our sector and often in our institutions, we think it's about us, right? So many processes that foundations have, from how you decide what to fund, to what people have to do to get your funding, to what happens after you give them funding. So many of those things are really dictated by the needs and desires and ideas of people within our institution, right? So often in family philanthropy or even corporate philanthropy, what you fund is not a result of listening deeply to your grantees or to the field or to the community that you're working in, but it might be like somebody around your board table who has a passion for something and has the money, right, that they put into this fund. So I just haven't seen times where that kind of centering of yourself and centering of your own institution is effective and actually makes a dent. Like that you're just asking for two things that are unrelated to come together, basically. And I think that, it's in order to really shift and have this like lasting change, we have to basically let go of some of that power, right? Because fundamentally, all the crises that Pia just named that we all are living through right now, these are crises about who has power and who doesn't. And so if our philanthropy is an exercise in us holding power and hoarding power and exercising power, then there's no way we're going to change and shift that fundamental challenge. And then I'll just say this other thing that sounds like it's the opposite, which is that it's not about us, but it is also about us in that, as Pia said, we all are implicated, right? And so it is not possible to sort of do justice outside of your foundation, right? You can't be like, I fund equity and not actually try to live into it in your own institution, in your own processes. And so sometimes that's the harder work, right? But I think anything that we are trying to do, like the world that we're trying to fund and live, we have to fund it and also live into it. With every small step we take, we have to act like we actually are trying to build that world as well.
Thank you, Dimple. Moving to you, John, how would you respond to this question of why is it so urgent to embrace a trust-based approach right now?
Well, this is what I would say is if it was that just philanthropy had created mechanisms that caused challenges to communities and that would be a problem in itself. But what that practice has actually done is caused communities to not be able to fully realize themselves. And that is a problem that expands way beyond the idea of, am I practicing these 6 things or whatever the case may be? The idea of, evaluation, right? We spend a lot of time here thinking about evaluation. The idea that we have created structures, philanthropy has, in community that government and others have followed, right? That allow people to say, you're only as valuable as what you count by what we said you should be counting, right? That because of that, and not one time, but years and years of that, when you ask an organization, tell me what your North Star is, right? Like, I'm excited to learn from you about where you're going as a community. They will tell you an answer as it relates to what a philanthropy or an industry of philanthropy would want. And shame on us, right? That's a disaster. Or governance. Governance originated as a community organizing strategy. Something happened to my child. I want to bond together with my other community members, lock arms, create an organization, and solve that problem. That was the original intent of governance. Is that governance today? No way. right? And we as philanthropy have created engines that are being practiced every day that cause communities to not know themselves. And so when we put words like innovative practice on top of that, like collective impact, my view, that's moving communities away from knowing themselves. And so for me, trust-based philanthropy, it's valuable right now, and it's valuable yesterday and 10 years ago, because every day we practice something that causes communities to be removed from what is beautiful and gritty and graceful about them. We are doing practice that causes them to move away from that. So it's important right now. It was important yesterday, and it was important a decade ago, and even more. And so we have to get back to an original intent of why we're doing this work, and remove structures, many of them structures based upon race, to move us in other areas and move us into a place where we are creating and moving with our community folks and helping them lead to their own self-determinations. I was an offensive lineman in college. You don't pay attention to offensive linemen, right? No one's looking at them. Philanthropy is too much in front. We are supposed to be behind the scenes, right? And so right now we need to reposition ourselves to be supporters and enhancers of the steam of communities, as compared to having communities march and dance to the areas that we think are important.
Wow.
An offensive lineman is the blocker.
Football. Thank you for those powerful remarks from all three of you. We've got about 10 minutes before we go into breakouts, and I'd like to spend a little bit of time speaking to some of this ongoing work. All three of you have really spoken to this. You've spoken to the self-awareness, the self-reflectiveness that is a key part of this, the power awareness. Dimple and John have alluded to kind of the internal work that has to happen within organizations. We're also talking about the external work of building trust with communities over time, kind of undoing a lot of this kind of harm that we've done over time that has kind of become a huge barrier for nonprofits to actually, like John is saying, know themselves and really, kind of be able to articulate where they want to go. So let's focus in on this ongoing work. And Dimple, I'd like to start with you, because you really did address this briefly in your previous remarks about that internal work of what it takes to build trust internally. Can you speak to this? You've addressed this before in past webinars. Why is it that we need to invest internally before we go externally? And how do you see the roles of staff and board in this kind of context, building upon what John was saying about kind of, the origins of governance? I'm curious how you think about this at General Service Foundation.
So, practices are basically a reflection of our internal cultures and our internal values. And so, we've seen over this last period, as you said, Shadi, that, trust-based philanthropy is trending. So, we've seen partner foundations, do phone calls with people on my team to learn about particular practices we have. So I spoke a little bit about the reporting practice, right? So we had a foundation reach out to us and say, "Oh, we loved what we heard about your reporting practice, and can you talk us through how you did it?" And then a few months later, we heard from a shared grantee who told us that this foundation had now moved towards doing reports doing phone calls instead of written narrative reports. And that the grantee found it to be an even more burdensome experience because it was quarterly phone calls. And the phone calls lasted for hours because the program officer was trying to capture a series of metrics and was trying to capture basically all the information that would have gone into a really burdensome report, right? But now it was on the fly. And so our call is 3 questions, right? It's a dialogue. And so what that said to me was that organization made a practice change, but they didn't make a culture change, right? And so that program officer is reporting to someone who's reporting to someone who's reporting probably to a board, that has all of those layers. In those layers, there are still a set of assumptions around control, around metrics, around what, like, the power we have as funders, what is supposed to be delivered by a grantee. All of that didn't change. It was just a little practice change, right? I'll also just say, though, that it's so much easier to change a practice than it is to change culture. And I learned this firsthand my first month on the job at GSF, when I tried to change what I thought was something really small. So I came in, and every time I would try to schedule a meeting with one of my team members, it involved a series of 6 to 10 emails back and forth with people saying, well, I'm available this time or that time. And I kept saying, where's the shared calendar? Because every place I'd ever worked, you just schedule meetings by like looking at people's calendars. We didn't have one. And so one of the quick fixes I wanted to make was, let's just all have a shared calendar. And I got a tremendous amount of pushback. And I was told we didn't have the right technology. When I pointed out that we did, I heard all these other concerns. And I kept answering every concern by talking about the technology and how it was going to make our lives better, until I actually paused and listened and realized that it wasn't about the practice of sharing calendars. It was actually like what people were pushing back against, or what they were holding onto, was that our practice of not sharing calendars reflected a culture of autonomy, right? That like people felt like they had previously been able to control their time and, not have to show what they were doing with their time. And so what I learned was that I actually, in making a process change, needed to explicitly talk about the cultural change that was going along with it. And in that case, with the calendars, I talked about creating a culture of collaboration and transparency. And I just named it. And so, I think as you all are doing these like institutional changes, it's not about the practice, right? It's not about switching to multi-year support. It is, but culturally, it's about giving grantees a runway, right? And culturally, it's about understanding that social change doesn't happen in a year. And culturally, it's about saying, if we trust this grantee, they don't have to prove themselves again a year from now, and then again 6 months from then, right? So those are all the culture pieces that just are slower, but when you shift that stuff, then like the process stuff just flows.
Wow, thank you so much, Dimple. That was really great. John, I'd love to turn to you to speak to some of that ongoing work externally in building trust with grantees and communities. What is that ongoing work, and what do we need to be mindful of as we do that?
Yeah, I might start with something to be mindful of, because I think it gears us a little bit on how we kind of work every day to earn the trust of the communities that we're so fortunate to serve in, is that we could lose that trust at any minute. It's not as if we work for all of these years and then just sit back and say, bet they trust me, that's good, right? Like, we got to earn that every day. And that's our focus, right? And so not only developing what we call good bedside manner to community and being good listeners and the practices that we do, but we also have to recognize, like, what is our superpower as a funder, and what is the superpowers of folks on the ground, and folks that we're lucky enough to partner with. So, one example is we are able to see, because are able to partner with a lot of different groups, that if we're looking at that information and we're learning about it in its totality, we can make connections from a group over here that has told us about this really amazing thing, but they need this. to an organization over here who has that, right? And if we're reading all of those threads, when I was a consultant in New York, I met with a couple of times some of the leading poverty funders in the city. And I remember my last meeting with them, I asked them, like, well, you guys get like 3 reports from every grantee a year. Like, what is the state of poverty in New York City? You have access to a ton of information. And they looked at me like I was showing a dog a card trick. I mean, they just had no idea what these areas were. And it's because they weren't reading this information. Reading that information would have allowed them to use that superpower that funders have in making connections between groups. And so we call that sugar sharing, right? And so, which is what neighbors do, right? You go across the street and borrow sugar from each other and you help each other out. And I think for us, our power is trying to figure out how do we get a sector in Baltimore, the industry of the amount of money that's spent to nonprofits in New York, in Baltimore every year is about $1.7 billion, right? And institutional philanthropy is about 20% of that. So should there be more money spent on that? For sure, or maybe 2, 3. I have no, there's a better economist than me that can help with that. But what I do know is that there needs to be a better use of that 1.7 across. And what philanthropy has done is caused groups to not realize that partnership and sharing sugar is something that can maximize results. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be funding the way we should be funding. But we did an exercise, and we do it often with our grantees, in which we say, write on green cards all of the assets you have as an organization, and on red cards, write down all of the needs that you have. And then the goal is, after that exercise, is to match the red and the green. And if you total up all of the things that they need, and the last time we did it right before COVID, it was about almost $1 million, but actually $910,000. When you made that connection and match, the group only really needed $170,000. So through sharing, and that's, we're not trying to advocate less money, we're trying to advocate better usage of money. And the only way you can do that is if you have trusted relationships with groups on the ground. And what's my superpower within that is the ability to make connections and dots, because I have the ability to do work at this level. My job is not to go at the ground level and tell them how to do their work. They are experts on the ground every day doing that work. And so my job is to try to figure out, how can I, in my role, make those connections? And so, Shadi, I don't know if I'm 100% answering your question, other than to say, building trust is also coming to the table and recognizing what you bring to the table, and then trying to use that in those trusted relationships to advance all of us together. Where we break down trust is when I come on the ground and say, I think I have a better idea on how to do your work every day. If you walked in my house and told me, I think you should move your kitchen table somewhere else, as my mom would say, she might smack you in the mouth, right? Like, that's not what we should be doing. I'm not advocating violence, but what I'm advocating for is the idea is to not go into places where you're not an expert at, and use what you have to be able to do to help a coalition of folks share sugar more effectively.
Wow, thank you. And we're right on time to move into our break. Reflection point. Initially we were going to wrap this with really, short responses to why we should embrace trust-based philanthropy. I think we've already heard a lot of that from our speakers. But I would just invite our speakers to just, in 1 minute or less, one final point or insight or takeaway you hope people will carry with them, especially as many of us go into breakouts to reflect with colleagues. And why don't we start with you, Dimple? What's a final kind of reflection for our group today?
So a final reflection is that less bureaucracy for your grantees also means less bureaucracy for you as a funder. And it frees you up to actually do some of the juicier work and the more impactful work that that we just heard about, the sugar sharing, right? The big picture, like, work that oftentimes we don't get the space to do because we're pushing paper and we're just, so I think the secret of trust-based philanthropy, we talk about it as something that the field needs and that benefits our grantees. But it's actually so much more satisfying and joyful to work this way as a funder.
More joy. Yes. Thank you, Dimple. John, how about you? One final kind of parting word for our group.
So what I would just say real quickly, knowing I'm not often quick, is trust-based philanthropy, as you saw in the beginning, and I think Pia was scared of this, about this, putting it on a t-shirt type of thing, or like running down a checklist. Like, trust-based philanthropy is early in its efforts. There's a lot of realizations that this field can come to. And part of that work is not to subscribe to the idea that I'm trust-based because I'm doing all the six, but continually every day figure out those barriers that cause you not to have authentic relationships to community. Because what I know is that if you're developing that every day, the work's going to be better. It just is going to be better. And so if you could do all the six and realize that you still have separation. So find out within it is for your own efforts of what, where are your accountability partners that are pressing their thumb in the side to say, hey, you're really stepping wrong here. If you don't have any of them, you're a long ways away. There's a number of areas that you could work on all the time to help you continually build trust. And the six are really important, but I would venture to say as we move along that there's a lot of other areas where you could be working on this. So I'm excited to work in partnership with you to make it happen.
Thank you, John. And Pia, your final parting words before we go in breakouts.
I'm just going to say that I'm in love with Dimple and John, and I think we're all already partnered, so I'm not going to try to force myself onto anyone. But I find that I fall in love with trust-based philanthropy practitioners all the time because there's so much humility and there's so much willingness to like change and grow. When I first took a executive leadership job, one of my mentors said to me, if after your first year, there are no haters, no one's pushing back on you, and like, basically you're not ruffling any feathers, you're probably not doing anything. And I must be doing something because I do have a fair amount of haters, including like an online Twitter troll. But I will say, I would pay attention to who's pushing back. Like, who's pushing back on what you're trying to do? Is it people who are uncomfortable with sharing power or changing preferences, or not willing to interrogate power and bias? Or the people pushing back, the folks that have the least power in whatever system you're in, because I think that to me, in my mind, there's like good pushback around people just saying, whoa, that's uncomfortable. You're asking me to share decision-making. You're asking me to listen when I have a Harvard degree, But if the people pushing back and saying, hey, this is not right or fair, are the people you literally are trying to help and support, then I think that's another thing to listen for.
Thank you, Pia. That's a great parting word for us. We are now going to move into breakouts. So there's some instructions because some of you who are members of our hosting partner organizations have been pre-assigned to a breakout room. So we are going to start sending people to rooms now, and I'm going to give Jacob the cue to send us all to those pre-assigned rooms. If you are a PSO member of one of the hosting organizations and you are not automatically assigned, please send a note to Jacob TBP Project. He's here today. He's helping route us to our rooms. He will get you to where you need to go. If you're assigned to the wrong room, come back to the main room and we'll make sure you get to where you need to go. And if you're not affiliated with one of our hosting organizations and you still want to engage with each other, stay in the main room and we will have a large group discussion with those who are not affiliated with one of our hosting organizations. So lots of options. And if you have to go, that's also totally fine. We hope you'll join us for the next session. And Jacob, you can start sending people to breakouts now.
Will do. Okay.
And for those that are sticking around, thank you. Thank you to Dimple. She has to leave. Thank you so much. John and Pia are going to stick around. And we also have some other kind of special guests joining some of the small group breakouts. So we've got a lot of moving parts. If you're still confused and don't know where you need to be, just either send a direct message to Jacob TBP Project. If you are not a member of one of the participating partner organizations, then please stick around. We're going to keep talking if you want to keep engaging. And if you have to go, again, thank you. Thanks for being with us. We hope you'll join us on July 20th. I had the date wrong before. It's not July 23rd, July 20th, where we'll hear from other perspectives on this, because there's a lot of different embodiments of trust-based practices. But again, the values are what kind of unite us all. Jacob, how are we doing? Is everyone kind of getting settled into their rooms?
Yeah, most people are. There are some direct messages coming into me that I will be going through one by one. So please be a little patient as I find you. And most are in their breakout rooms as we speak.
And am I being jumped into one? Is that the idea?
Yes, I'm going to get you there, John. I'm just trying to figure out how to do that.
Leave him here, I say.
I mean, by the way, John, I'm going to take your offensive linebacker thing. One metaphor I've used is like learn how to be a backup dancer.
Right.
Like stop trying to like push the like whatever J-Lo off the stage. But I like that one. I need to learn a few more sports, different kinds of sports. So basically that we're in a team sport, you know,
That's
like
right. Yeah.
philanthropy is a team sport, not like you don't have to be an individual solo star as an institution or as a
Yeah,
leader.
yeah. I was a hip hop fan, so you could be the hype person for the
Okay.
main rapper. Yeah,
There we
yeah.
go. The hype person. We could be, yeah. Or one of the fly girls. I don't know. There's a lot there with hip hop.
Now when we hang out, we're gonna have to go dancing, and Shadi, you're invited too.
Oh yeah, I'll be there.
All right.
I think John
sit
just
down
took
with
you to your room.
All right, I'll go to my room.
Okay.
Bye.
That has a weird sound to it. I sent John to his
Go to
room.
your room, John.
Okay. All right, so we've got 60 people here. Thanks for sticking with us. Oh, Danielle, you need to go to your room.
See, that also sounds funny, Shadi. It sounds like you're.
It is time. Oh yeah, do we have any of our, and Amanda too? I think you can go to your room. Jacob, can you get Danielle to the New Mexico room and Amanda to the Missouri room?
Yes, I will be on that as soon as possible.
Actually, you know what? I can do that.
Okay.
Liliana, such a great question.
Why don't you kind of keep the conversation going, and I'll help people get to rooms that need to go.
Thank you.
Well, I think there's a question here, and I heard it in the chat earlier about international funding versus like US based funding. And we don't have any of the reps that do that in our network here, but there is some incredible trust-based philanthropy happening internationally with folks like Thousand Currents, and there's a few other networks that are incredible. They're funding grassroots movements in the global South, basically. And it's, I mean, I think the way that I understand it is they have kind of deep-rooted local partners that they have trusted relationships with, and then those partners have trusted relationships with the communities in Nepal or Mexico or wherever. So Liliana, I'm happy to connect you, and I think Shira was curious about that. We're happy to connect you to those practitioners as well. I believe hiding somewhere in this general room is also one of our steering committee members, unless he left. Phil, are you here? Phil.
No, I just sent him to Missouri.
Oh, bye, Phil. Go to Missouri. I thought you were staying here with us.
Can I add a comment to your response?
Yes, please. Did I say your name right? Okay.
Yeah, you said
Okay.
it right. Yes. Thank you. I would be really interested in having a conversation with funders that do a lot of funding internationally, because at least in terms of one of the principles of trust-based philanthropy, which is the general operating support, there are big differences.
Yeah.
I attended the webinar on legal considerations, and I think that's one of the least explored, let's say, barriers or arguments that we woke funders have explored. Because in some ways, I think that boards or the institutions are willing to make the leap but then they face the IRS
Right.
regulations, and that's
Right.
where they come, they just paralyze.
Yeah.
So if there was a room for all of us who have experienced those difficulties, I think we can come up with creative ways of addressing those.
Yeah. See,
That was
I
my
mean,
point.
and I think it could be, we could probably do a webinar about it. I think there's also, depending on the country, there are also political barriers to both unrestricted funding and kind of dedocumentation. So, I mean, I think the value that I would try to insert there, regardless of what kind of, policy or bureaucratic hurdles that folks have to go through, is to do our best to sort of over accommodate for the time and effort and translation and translating those things, like putting that on our side, on the funder side, as opposed to expecting the grantee partners in Nepal or India or whatever to navigate those hurdles with their more limited time and resources. So we, the ones with sort of access and lawyers and time, if we could figure all that out and make the easiest path to resources for the partners we're trying to support, it would probably look different in different contexts, like, different countries and regions. But I think this is a good bookmark for us to think about a session for international trust-based grant making, actually. I see another really cool question in here. Is it Tyrell? Do you want to ask your question? But it sounds like you're curious about when did people start using the term?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi.
Yes, I was very curious about when they started using the term trust-based philanthropy and giving, because I know I'm based out of Trenton, and I know for a long period of time when it came to Black and Brown-led organizations and organizations of people of color, they it's kind of like a philanthropic redlining going on, with giving them the funds. So I just want to say, is this like this term is a way to combat that? Or is this like a new wave to say, let's open up our giving? Because I read this book called Grassroots Philanthropy, when where the guy was basically saying, let's just go in there and find their needs, see what they want. Let's not take them through a whole grant processing, it's just a short ask form and there's a turnover on their immediate need. So I'm just curious on with this whole term of trust-based giving, is it like to combat the philanthropic redlining when it comes to Black and Brown organizations, or is it to open up the whole process to organizations that have been left out of the philanthropic sector for a long time?
Yeah, I mean, I think both, and I know exactly what you're talking about in terms of redlining, in terms of the tiny percentage of philanthropic dollars that actually go to Black and Brown led organizations, even though organizations say they're serving those communities, but then they're white led. It's definitely one of the values that we're holding. I mean, at my foundation, we specifically made like a front end decision to only fund organizations with budgets of less than $1 million or a lot less than $1 million, and with what the board at the beginning called it non-traditional leaders, but it was really like Black and Brown Indigenous folks that just do not traditionally get foundation funding, and we were often the first foundation funder, and sometimes we've been the only foundation funder. In terms of the phrase being used, I think that it depends on who's using it. I think some folks are using it just as a way to talk about not having paperwork, which is helpful, but I think some people are talking about it as a way to combat white supremacy, and racism that are built into our systems. I mean, I think actually in some ways it's overly interpretable right now. Like you can kind of use it for what you want to use it for. And I think we do need to be we need to be very specific that we feel like when we're talking about power, we're talking about white supremacist power structures, systems, and culture, and that we believe that this is countercultural to that. This approach is countercultural to that. I think we start with these like very doable practices because it feels so tangible, but like Dimple said, what we're going for ultimately is a culture shift, where there isn't this redlining, and where philanthropy sees it as its job to end that kind of disparity. So, but thank you for bringing that up. And I think people want to know the name of the book that you read.
It's called Grassroots Philanthropy. I forgot that I got it at my house, not in my office. And,
okay.
I'm gonna look it up before I leave the chat, but it's called Grassroots Philanthropy.
Got it. Thank you.
Hi, this is Maria. This is Maria Vizcarrondo. I have a question for you. And I'm with the Council of New Jersey Grant Makers. And I know Mr. Smith from Trenton, so good to see you. There wasn't enough time in the conversation, obviously, because you could talk about everything, about how this process, the trust-based philanthropy, can have a very effective impact on being able to build the right kind of collaborations and cooperations that could really help to scale out different issues or problems that come up that are funded initially.
Yeah. I mean, we really believe in funder collaborations. I think John talked about it as like sugar sharing. I think it is really effective across regions. I'd say it's also effective across issues like climate, democracy, and also maybe identity areas. Like I've seen really, really powerful collaborations like currently right now around funding Black-led political and social movement groups. Like for instance, the Democracy Frontlines Fund is a really great example. That's a funder collaborative. They're funding 10 Black-led national organizations who are kind of at the front lines of protecting voter rights and building power in Black communities. So agree, because the principles are so much about collaboration, it's also, I think, pushing funders to collaborate with each other. You often hear funders saying, hey, you 5 nonprofits should collaborate. But I mean, do funders collaborate with each other? Do we all say like, oh, you're funding in this space, like how can we collaborate more? So, definitely that kind of collaboration, I think these values and principles can be really effective. Shadi, I don't know if I'm doing the right thing right now. I feel like we're supposed to be talking about
No, this is great. This is just
okay.
to engage more deeply, and
Okay.
we're kind of just going with the flow. So this is perfect. Thank you. We're kind of on the back end trying to get people to their rooms. So
Oh, awesome. Okay, so let's good questions. I don't know if I'm the best at the corporate funder one. Samuel, is it possible to push TBP values down to the white-led organizations we have traditionally supported? Samuel, do you want to speak to that a little? I think this is a great question. I'm curious, where it's coming from and what, if you're still here.
I'm here.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Sometimes I'm a puffin in case anybody
Oh,
cares,
hey,
but so hi, yeah, I'm a very small family foundation working primarily in a single county in New Jersey, with a few outlying projects, but we do have dealt for a long time in sort of along the value stream that we're talking about here, but with a lot of organizations that are doing exactly what you were talking about, which is, with great intentions and on behalf of communities that are lacking in resources or redlined out or whatever it is, led by primarily, if not exclusively, white leadership, both at the board and staff levels, right? And a real question, not only about why do they look the way they look, why do we look the way we look, but also, to what extent are they listening to the community, or are they in fact, defining program work and moving forward with their own agendas in these communities rather than really sort of listening to what's bubbling up from the community. Just a question about how to sort of raise that issue with the organizations themselves.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, it's towing a delicate line, right? Like being a funder and then having suggestions for, how your nonprofits could or should operate. I have my gut response is like, let's just move our funding to, community accountable organizations that demonstrate that in who's on their executive leadership team and who's on their board. But I also think that I have a story to share. There's a regional funder in Southern California that had the same question about some of their longer term grantee partners that they didn't really want to just all of a sudden let go of as they shifted to a more racial justice focus. So they started to build into some of their questions. It was like they weren't pushing an agenda. They just started to ask, what is what mechanisms do you have to get feedback from community? And what are the real demographics of your staff and board? as, you know, part of the foundation's own exploration about equity and racial equity, they started to build that inquiry into how they were relating to their partners. And then every once in a while, there just would have to be a difficult conversation with a long-term white white-led nonprofit leader, a white nonprofit leader, about sort of being self-reflective about that and possibly being willing to start to share power or transition, you know, the leadership of the organization. And what was uncomfortable about it was that particular foundation was actually led by white folks as well. The board was very diverse. So there were all these different nuances to it, but I think they tried to hold the whole thing less like this is a punitive, we're grading you, and more like we're in this exploration about giving up power and, you know, racial equity ourselves. So how can we be learning about things together? So I think holding a learning stance is often more well received than we're going to cut off your funding unless you make this change, you know, or feel like you're getting graded on some kind of, you know, report card that you weren't getting graded on before. And I think that vulnerability and that honesty can go a really long way, you know, because anything that comes from our desk can always sound like it's condescending and patriarchal. So it's like that relational, like, let me have a conversation with you. We're struggling with this ourselves. I mean, a story I didn't get to tell is that when I've really messed up, you know, one time I accidentally, I had extra dollars in my portfolio for like 3 years in a row. And I just kept giving them to one of, you know, an annual grantee partner, someone we hadn't committed to for multi-year support, but I would like look and I'd say, oh my gosh, I have this much money left. Let me, like, you know, give it to this great organization. And then one year I didn't have money left and they were shocked, you know, not to get funding. And they felt very misled by me. They felt like I had implied that they were going to get continuous funding. I'm out here talking about trust-based philanthropy and unrestricted multi-year support. So I had to really like eat crow and say, I really was not thinking. I wasn't thinking about the implications of my actions. I thought it was this great thing I was doing. I had extra money in my budget and I needed to get out the door. So I thought, here I am doing this good thing. And then I created this expectation that I disappointed them quite deeply. And so I just think like our willingness to tell those kinds of stories about ourselves, about our hiring, about our boards, about the difficulties we face in really demonstrating racial equity and racial justice in our culture and systems, if we're transparent about that to our partners, then I think when we ask questions into what's happening for them, it comes off differently. Mm-hmm. Okay,
yeah, just since there's silence, I'll just follow it up by saying, you know, it would, you're absolutely right that finding the smaller organizations led by people of color in the community would be great. These guys are major players, right? And they're really having a significant impact in the way that they do, which may or may not be exactly right, but it would be detrimental to cut them off, right? So.
Yeah. Well, there's one other resource would be Brenda Solorzano at Headwaters in Montana. She took over this public health foundation, one of the biggest public health foundation in Montana a few years ago. And she created this process where she literally she cut the state up into 4 regions and she did these town halls back when we could all be in town halls. And she literally let all the nonprofits in the region determine which larger nonprofit was the most accountable to the whole and should get the multi-year funding. And her board thought she was crazy that they were going to like all fall apart and just start attacking each other. But literally in all 4 regions, every single region unanimously identified the organization that they thought was the biggest one that should get the biggest multi-year support. So maybe you're not going to move the funding, but maybe creating processes where like the whole network is able to give feedback in even direct dollars, I think, you know, is a power shifting thing already. Yeah, oh, Brenda's coming to that July 20th, not 23rd session. So please listen for Brenda. Bethany's asking a question, just, I don't know if it's a question. You're looking for partners in Northwest Philly, Bethany? Did you also have a question that we could dig into, or are you just kind of putting it out there that you're looking for partners? Are you here, Bethany? I don't know.
I sent Bethany a direct response that we're
Okay.
we're in conversation with Philanthropy Network of Philadelphia about a cohort.
Awesome. So we really only have 3 minutes left. Does anyone have a question or a comment?
No, other than this was really great, very informative. This is really, really great. I'm looking forward to the next sessions.
So glad that y'all are here. It's great. The spread, you know, it's like a national spread. See if we missed any questions.
As Pia's looking for those, I just want to thank you all for sticking around and for bearing with us as we tried a bunch of new Zoom techniques today. I know for you all, you didn't go into breakout, so you don't have to deal with some of that wrangling that we did, but thanks for being with us. This is just the beginning. As you know, there's a lot that we can tackle. We really wanted to address some of these fundamentals today, and then we'll talk more about what it looks like to operationalize these practices July 20th and then on September 14th. So we hope you'll stick around and we'll share. Oh, Pia, go ahead. Sorry.
Shadi, you're always awesome. You're like a goddess. I don't know how you do what you do. There is one question that we didn't get to. It says, when there are more community identified needs than dollars available, how do trust-based funders prioritize? I have like 3 different immediate responses. One is, if we're in relationship and network with a constellation of funders in our region or issue area or identity group, then hopefully that sugar sharing thing can be realized, right? So it's not that, it's more like donor collaboratives, for instance, like when I'm in them, it's so amazing because we're a network of funders who are all saying we're funding, I don't know, racial justice and democracy or something like that. So one, I think being not so siloed and collaborating with other funders. 2, being very clear about what my institution's like purpose and purview and accountability is, you know? And I think that as the Whitman Institute, we were never going to be able to fund everyone who really could qualify to be in our sweet spot. But one lens that I always used is the leadership of the group I want to fund. Like their mission looks great, their strategies are amazing, they seem accountable to community. Does the leadership demonstrate humility, listening, and collaboration as a leadership style? Because there's amazing organizations everywhere, led by people of color, led by non-traditional leaders, but what's the leadership ethos of that organization? And I tended to gravitate towards co-leadership models, towards people who had really strong sensibilities of listening to their staff and their constituents. And so that would sometimes help like break the tie for me. And then, you know, it also is like dollars available this year. So sometimes it would be like, if I can get to them next year, or if I can recommend them to other funders I know who I might not be in a collaborative fund with, but I might be able to point them in a good direction. So I think we can end on actually answering that question, Shadi, right?
That's great. Yeah, thank you, everyone. We hope to see you on July 20th. Thanks for being with us and have a great rest of your week. And thanks again to our fabulous speakers and our partners. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Shadi.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Shadi. And thank you, Pia.
Yes, thanks, Pia. Thanks, Dimple. I think John and Dimple are gone.
Yeah.